Greetings everyone, this is Ohio Dan. Today's video topic is feminist versus egalitarian conclusions, and my overall kind of critique and breakdown of gender egalitarianism. And in this video, I want to evaluate the merits of gender-based egalitarianism and compare what the likely outcome of this type of system would be compared to the late-stage results of feminism, third and fourth wave feminism that we see today. I will be evaluating the advantages and drawbacks of trying to implement such a system compared to what we have now, and what my ultimate opinion is about whether gender egalitarianism is a substantially better way to move forward, or if it's a fundamentally flawed idea that really doesn't give much of an advantage compared to what we already have now. So, to start off with, we need to understand that there are several potential definitions for equality based on gender that people seem to utilize, that I've seen over the years in the men's community, the anti-feminist community, which tend to get thrown around as if they're interchangeable, as if people are always referring to the same thing, even though that's clearly not the case. A lot of these definitions are very much different from one another, and I'm going to break that down here because this lack of consistent meaning about what it means to be an egalitarian is one of the first hurdles that a gender egalitarian belief system must overcome. If we can't really agree on which definition we're using, then we're already in trouble. In this analysis, I'll be looking at three variations of gender egalitarianism that I've seen used in the community in the past while evaluating the merits and shortcomings of each. The first possible meaning that I've seen used when it comes to identifying as a gender egalitarian is that men and women are equally human and therefore equally deserving of whatever we establish as human rights. Fundamentally, I'm inclined to agree with this idea. I don't believe that men are inherently superior in terms of their humanity, their human nature, compared to women or vice versa. I think we are all equally human. There are a few problems with how this is implemented, though. For one, this idea of equal humanity has been tainted a great deal by gynocentric thinking and gynocentric policies to mean that women are the ones who need more consideration in terms of human rights based on a victim narrative. However, when we look at how men and boys are treated around the world objectively, having their lives thrown away or suffering injuries in various conflicts or situations that women are more often protected from, you could look at workplace deaths and injuries as well along with that, the conclusion should be that men deserve greater consideration based on an equal application of human rights. If you actually are applying this concept objectively, that men and women are equally human and should have certain rights respected, we should actually be doing more to help men in that regard at this point, because honestly, women are far more protected and don't have to deal with a lot of the things that men and boys are having to deal with. In theory, this could work out to men's benefit if we would apply this type of gender egalitarianism objectively, but only if we actually examine the human rights abuses for what they are, only if we're honest about what we're seeing and not looking at things through a gynocentric lens. Unfortunately, that's typically what we see going on in modern times, is there is this gynocentric lens where it's just about we need to help women, women's human rights are being abused. We live in a rape culture and all this kind of stuff, when really men are the ones that are ending up homeless. They're the ones that are ending up potentially being violated in prison. Men are the ones that are falsely accused of things, don't get a fair trial, don't get a fair say in anything. You could talk about what human rights are and what they're not. I'm not going to get into that in this video because that's missing the point that overall men are the ones having their rights abused more often than women. So you can use this criteria of gender egalitarianism as being equally human, but only if you're going to apply it objectively for what it really represents for men and for women. Another core problem with basing gender egalitarianism solely on the idea of men and women being equally human is that such a statement is like declaring apples and oranges equally fruit, despite the vast differences between these two items. Beyond having an understanding of how to treat everyone with a minimal level of consideration, this concept does little to address the actual problems arising from the differences between how men and women usually function and operate. Just because we are equally human, it does not follow that we actually have very much in common. And if you look at men and women and the things that motivate us and the way that we operate, in most cases, we don't have a whole lot in common. And so that's a major shortcoming here. If you try to make peach marmalade or an orange pie, despite oranges and peaches both being equally fruit, it's probably not going to turn out in a way that tastes very good in most cases. It's probably not going to lead to a satisfactory product because oranges are not really very good for pies and peaches really aren't appropriate for marmalade. That's basically the limitation that we deal with when asserting that men and women are equally human. We are, but so what? So although I agree with the core idea of equal humanity regardless of gender, this is grossly insufficient when addressing the problems that men and women face while interacting with each other, or the legitimate grievances that men have with the current social structures in place that actively discriminate against them. At some point, you have to go beyond just saying, well, we're equally human, and actually analyze how we work out our problems, work out our differences together, and this variation of gender egalitarianism really doesn't go that far. The second definition or application of gender egalitarianism that I've seen acknowledges that men and women are different in many ways, but claims that each gender is of equal value as a whole in terms of what they have to offer. So it's not just being equally human, it's also, as this form of egalitarianism claims, the idea that we are equal in terms of our overall capabilities within humankind. There are a few key reasons for why this idea is problematic in practice. Probably the most serious of these is that at some point, you actually have to prove mathematically that this is the case, demonstrating the idea of equal value through specific examples. What do men do, and how many points is that worth in terms of what they're offering? What do women do, and how many points is that objectively worth? And it's not completely objective. It's still going to come down to opinion to some extent, but you do have to do this comparison. It can't just be the assumption that men and women have equal value because you're saying that that's so. You actually have to show what men and women do for society and how that's roughly equal using some sort of mathematical figure. Compared to the male role of acting as provider and protector for all of civilization, what role do women play collectively that could possibly be considered an equivalent to this? Honestly, this type of gender egalitarian will likely need to claim that a woman's capacity for having children is what makes her equally valuable. But considering the reproductive choices that women often make today, especially in Western countries, along with the fact that the planet now holds over 8 billion living people, it is doubtful that this capacity for making babies equals all the things that men do collectively to build and maintain most of civilization, and pretty much have always been expected to do throughout human history, if we're being honest. It's 90% men that are creating and maintaining everything you see around you, is making babies really equal to that in terms of the value that's given. I'm not convinced that we see women actually performing as equals when it comes to the total value of what they create compared to what men create, compared to what men produce. And we also know that men are net taxpayers and women aren't. You can compare it that way as well. But I'm just not convinced that this assertion that men and women have equal value, if you assess how we're different and look at what we're both good at, do women really step up and do things that are the same value as men if you're not going to assign disproportional weight to reproduction? Because that's honestly the main thing that I see women doing, making babies and, in theory, raising those children, but you're not necessarily going to have access to that family unit as a man in the current environment and state of things anyway. So the value that women add compared to building and maintaining civilization, I'm not convinced that unless you skew the math, that you can get the result that you're looking for if you are a gender egalitarian on this basis using this particular definition. Another problem with this variation of gender egalitarianism as equal value between men and women is that even if the math would bounce out somehow, it still doesn't address the lack of incentive for men to participate in conventional relationships today. In order for this bounce between what men and women function better at to matter in any way, there needs to be reciprocity for how this is implemented in a marriage or family structure. Instead, men are expected to perform their traditional gender roles while also doing half of everything once considered part of the woman's domain of activity. Right? You get to do half of everything else, but you still need to act as a traditional man. Men are traditional, women can be feminists and not do anything for you, and you're just supposed to accept that as equal value. This is before even factoring in the great risk involved for men when a relationship unravels and his family dissolves, along with the many other dangers that women can represent now in a post-feminist society where you've seen things like Me Too and the Duluth model and one-sided reproductive rights. All of these things are things you have to contend with as a man now. Where is the value in that? Where is this men and women can equally contribute to a family structure when women have the ability to basically just do what they want, and then you as a man are supposed to be traditional, as I stated? That's not really equal value, even if you wanted to argue that women had the capacity for equal value in terms of what they do in the first place. Without addressing how these things women are supposedly good at can make a material improvement in the overall lives of men, and vice versa as well, the things that men are already really expected to do for women, it doesn't seem to matter much if equal value or potential value is demonstrated in a way that's convincing. Ultimately, however, I don't think that this equal value exists when evaluated from an intellectually honest perspective, and that this form of gender egalitarianism is pretty much based on bad math and bad assumption making, instead of comparing what average men and women really have to offer each other in practice. A third definition for gender egalitarianism that I've seen used within the community in the past is that aside from having different biological parts and playing different roles in reproduction, men and women are actually equal across the board, and all meaningful differences exist only between individuals. Egalitarianism and equality as interchangeability, basically. That a woman that is average is basically the same as a man who's average, except they have different parts. This is the easiest variation of gender egalitarianism to criticize because it's not supported by much in the way of real-world evidence. Men do measurably better in many fields, such as engineering or business, and generally all the most physically and mentally taxing work in society, honestly, is performed by men. Again, fitting into the provider and protector role that men have pretty much always had an obligation to perform. In fact, I would call this particular belief system, this particular version of egalitarianism, feminism light, since even without the establishment of a patriarchy, an egalitarian of this sort could reach similar conclusions to what feminist ideology already asserts. In other words, if women are on average making less money than men, they're less likely to go into a STEM field of study, and they don't make it into leadership positions as often in business and in the political sphere compared to men, then what can explain this phenomenon if men and women are truly equally capable? Surely something must be putting women at a disadvantage if they can truly do all the same things that masculine men can do. So based on these premises, an explanation of men somehow gaming the system or oppressing women, that seems likely. You'd have to reach that sort of conclusion, which is the conclusion that feminism has already reached. Although a potential benefit of this thought process could be greater attention focused on issues disproportionately affecting men, like homelessness and suicide, because this type of egalitarian may say, well, all right, men and women are equal, but men end up homeless more often. We need to do something about that as well. The lack of female success, nonetheless, in male-dominated fields must necessarily be explained by some force preventing equal outcomes. And the force is likely to be something akin to male oppression and the patriarchy, as in feminist doctrine. If men and women are truly capable, then what's preventing women from doing the same things that men do? If you think men and women really are equal across the board, so-called true equality in that sense. Considering all this, whenever I see an egalitarian suggesting that men and women are truly equal in all aspects, I don't see this as anything substantially different being offered than the current status quo within the feminist framework, within the feminist version of supposed equality. It's really not going to lead to a different conclusion. You're not starting off with the same idea, but then if you think men and women are actually equal, and you look at women not being in these leadership positions and not going into STEM and the gender wage gap, which has been debunked 100 million times, but if you think men and women should be equal across the board, then what explains that outside of something like the patriarchy? So in my opinion, that's feminism light. That's just kind of a different way of reaching the same conclusions as a feminist, and really the worst form of egalitarianism, in my opinion, the least valuable form in terms of shifting gears and going to a more sustainable model. Ultimately, beyond where the concept of being equally human can apply, I think gender egalitarianism should be rejected as any sort of viable alternative to what we have going on today in our post-feminist world. Egalitarian theory sounds like it can be an improvement over what we have now, but it fails to account for the vast differences between average men and average women, given our different roles and characteristics, given sexual dimorphism being what it is. Yeah, we're equally human, but is there really equal value that men in aggregate versus women in aggregate bring to the table? And do we really see men and women just functioning the same or even close to the same way? There are so many differences that just trying to make men and women equal is not going to work, in my opinion. Equal value as a whole cannot be easily demonstrated or refuted for that matter, because it depends on the math that you do, but it seems to boil down to making babies having as much value as everything men do to build and maintain society, which doesn't make sense to me if we add appropriate weight to each contribution. As I've already stated, there's over 8 billion people in the world. Women are not as important as far as being a reproductive vessel. So what is it that women can actually point to and say that they're doing for society as much or more than men are doing? And I'm not seeing that. You could say that they're nurses more often, but then men are doctors. It just doesn't really add up when you actually start to do the comparison, in my opinion. If all men disappeared today, society as we know it would completely collapse within a few days. If all women disappeared and men didn't destroy each other out of sexual frustration, then we could persist potentially for several decades until men started dying off. The younger men now started to basically die of old age, and perhaps indefinitely, depending on the potential technological breakthroughs like the artificial womb that we would come up with. And so, in my opinion, this refutes the idea of equal value between the genders as a whole based on what men and women do. Interpreting gender equality as women being good as men across the board is even more precarious to defend and easier to dismiss without the need to add anything else to what I've already stated. It's just clear that the average man and the average woman are not good at the same things. You might try to say that the total of what they do adds up in terms of the value for society. That's a stretch. But to say that the average man and the average woman are good at the same things, it's so easy to refute that right away that's going to lead you to an erroneous conclusion that's similar to what feminism already states. That's very similar to what feminism is already saying about the patriarchy and women being oppressed. And so I reject that outright in terms of not having much value in moving forward. So what is my conclusion? Well, instead of gender egalitarianism, I think equity, in its original intended sense, is the better way that future societies can have more balance and reciprocity between the genders. I'm not talking about equity as it's being used in an academic sense today to basically say, well, you've achieved equality, but you're still oppressed, so we need to give you more stuff. Turning the tables of oppression. Equity is just a word that's used to replace equality once equality has been reached, so that people can have an excuse to continue to essentially try to take other people's rights away and try to punish other people still, even though equality's already been reached. That's not the type of equity I'm talking about. I'm talking about equity in terms of maximum benefit for everyone, in terms of reciprocity, in terms of all parties having a positive stake in the game. So that process would involve evaluating what men and women actually want from each other and dropping any pretense at achieving so-called real gender equality. Indeed, both men and women seem to not even want true gender equality in any case, with women not wanting to meet the male standards of performance when that is expected of them. Women don't like actually being treated like men in most cases. And men largely eschewing feminine institutions such as psychotherapy or the modern education system, which are totally from a feminine perspective, that are very gynocentric institutions for the most part. You see men distancing themselves from that. Men don't want to just talk things out. Men don't want to just cry to demonstrate their current emotional state. Men want to handle things differently than women and don't want to be treated the same as women, and women certainly don't seem to want to be treated the same as men. And just as a little caveat, as a little example, if you told women that your choice was between giving up your right to an abortion for any reason, you either give that up and you have a pro-life policy, or the alternative is men get the right to paternal surrender. You force equality, right? You have my body, my choice, and you have my money, my choice. Women do not support my money, my choice in most cases. They only support the feminist version of equality that can benefit them because they get the special privilege of having complete control over reproduction. But they don't want to support my money, my choice for men. And I can pretty much guarantee you that if you forced women to make a choice of actual gender equality, men have the right to sign some paperwork and opt out of being a father the same way that you can essentially have a procedure done and opt out of having a kid because you're pregnant. I guarantee you that if the option was either you allow men to have reproductive rights as well, or you give up your right to abortion of convenience, most women would go back to a traditional system. They would not want gender equality anymore. They only want so-called gender equality as it's defined now through feminist doctrine. Women do not want to have to meet the male standard of behavior and choice making. Men don't want to be treated like women either. So if we're being honest, most men and most women don't really even want true gender equality. Most women only support equality because that's been a political tool for them to get what they want from men. That's the honest case with this. That's just one example of what I'm talking about here. So only a culture that drops this idea of equality and focuses on establishing mutual benefit between men and women again, based on our relative needs and goals, can hope to create a stable system in the future where everyone feels like they have a positive stake in the game. That's what I mean by true equity. Otherwise, I believe we'll continue to be on the wrong track, chasing the elusive real gender equality that most people don't even want in the first place. Beyond the acknowledgement of being equally human, I don't see gender egalitarianism representing a solution to the problems we face between men and women today or into the future. And even the equally human aspect would be more about respecting men and boys' human rights, to be honest. All the rest of it is based on bad math. It's based on reworking feminism and pretending that it's not feminism because you care about men too. I really don't believe that gender equality or egalitarianism based on gender is going to go anywhere. I think as long as that is the opposition to feminism, that we're not going to have any real opposition to feminism. Along with traditionalism, which is still pretty much just the opposite side of the coin in terms of being gynocentric. So I think that unless we are willing to abandon all this talk about trying to make women and men be truly equal to one another and actually just start to look at, hey, women, what do you want from men? Men, what do you want from women? All right, let's create a system where each gender is expected to supply something positive to the other, and there's actually a net benefit. Unless we're really willing to have a serious conversation about what could lead to doing things that way, to moving things in that direction, probably in a future society and not the one that we have now, then it's hopeless. It's all nonsense. It's all BS. It's all about trying to get you to accept feminism light. Oh, we're all really equal, but somehow women are still not in these leadership positions. Oh, they just don't want to be. All these nonsense arguments that get around the fact that you're not really being offered an alternative. So those are my thoughts on gender egalitarianism. That's my critique of it. I do think there's value in being equally human, but again, apples and oranges are equally fruit. What does that tell you about what apples and oranges are actually good for? And then the other forms of egalitarianism are based on bad math and falsehoods. So overall, I reject gender egalitarianism as an alternative to feminism. And I think that as long as the idea of real gender equality seems to be the alternative to feminist theory, that we're really not going to go anywhere that's going to move things in a positive direction.